17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Greetings, my friends, and salutations. Welcome to the Richard James Show. It's a beautiful day outside. The sun is shining bright. A wonderful day to be alive. We have been conducting series of broadcasts on the issue of reparations. I have jumped into this thing. I've studied it, I've researched it, and I'm becoming more and more convinced that we are owed reparations. People of African descent in particular are owed reparations. Presidents have been set. Some reparations have been given to folks, but they've been given to the slave owners. You heard what I said? The slave owners, the ones who brutalized, captured, treated like animals, got reparations. They got their land returned. You know, there was a situation in Georgia where Sherman, who was the Union general, had agreed to give 40 acres and a mule to the blacks who were incarcerated, the blacks who were slaves and who were laborers, to give them something, to give them a start. And then Andrew Johnson, who took Lincoln's place after Lincoln was assassinated by another Southerner, John Wilkes Booth, reneged on that promise. And instead, you would think the South had won the war. Started turning away people of color, started giving what they should have back to the ones who committed those gross atrocities. Let's just look at the whole institution of slavery in this country. Now, first of all, let's do some clarification, because I'd like for people to know the naked truth. Africans did not first come here in 1619. That was the establishment or the institution of slavery. But Africans first came here as explorers. Let me say that again. Africans first came here as explorers, and were here for hundreds of years, and were indeed Native Americans. That's a fact. But then someone got the idea that human beings were a valuable commodity. So they began to raid villages in Africa, both on the East Coast and the West Coast and the center, and began to capture Africans. And one can only estimate how many Africans were captured. Some people estimate about 15 million were brought here. And many of those folks perished on the way here, okay? Now, how do you repair? How do you count for or give back to or give reparations to the people that you destroyed and you killed, that took their lives? what you try to do is take a look at the entire family of things and do something for them. It's my feeling that we're not just talking about a cash settlement. Some people see cash settlement as being total reparation. I don't see it that way. We know the Japanese uh, that were placed in concentration camps and were incarcerated and they lost their land, they lost their businesses. Many of them lost their lives. And they did everything to say, hey, we're not your enemy. They even had regiments, Japanese regiments that fought uh, uh, World War II on the American side. They did all of that. But yet they lost everything and they gave them a cash settlement of $20,000. That ain't nothing when you've lost it all. Nothing. It's almost a slap in the face. You need to be restored to where you were. If you're a business person, you need your business back. If you own land or property, you need your land back. You talk about reparations, then you got to really repair the damage that you have done. What are some of the positive things that this government has tried to do for people of color and for minorities? One thing they developed is what is called the Affirmative Action Program. Affirmative Action Program, believe it or not, came out of a Republican administration. You don't know that. And they're going to say, oh, no, it's true. See, government is a tale of cities, always has been. On one hand, they give and they support, and the other hand, they pull back. And I worked in government for many, many years. One time I was director of the state's affirmative action program in the Casey administration. That is to make sure that a couple of things. One, that businesses, minority businesses, get a piece of the action. So you set up a scientific method to equate the availability of minority business with the availability of business itself. And so, and those programs, some of them still exist. How effective they are, it remains to be seen. But most government agencies had some type of affirmative action program, and right-wingers and racists and fought it all away. And sometimes some minorities would fight that they shouldn't have affirmative action. Some of the members of the Jewish community fought against the affirmative action program. And some of them fought for the affirmative action program. So we're not going to stereotype any particular race of people. But we had many, many, many battles over that. Now, what I'm saying is that I see systematic racism that's been institutionalized in our government that becomes a way of life in our government. The way we do things. And minorities are left behind. And they even have a nerve to discriminate against women. Until the turn of the century, women were not given the right to vote. See, when you do all of those things, you not only had forced labor, many of our women during slavery were raped, either if they were chattel, but you had systematic discrimination. How do you compensate for that? How do you come up with a program to compensate for the things that are ongoing? Now we have a whole movement across the country against police brutality. Poorly trained, psychologically thick folks that hire some of these police force. And I'm not going to I don't condemn police force in general, because we need to monitor our crime-ridden streets. We need to protect our citizens, but we don't protect some. And beginning to gather and do research and pull together information on what's happening in this country. So let's take a look. First of all, we're gonna look at Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is a professor. I think she's at Howard University. She was made a presentation before the UN, the United Nations. And the United Nations was lifting up the whole issue of transatlantic slavery, and she was one of their keynote speakers. So let's look at her, and then we have another video. We'll take a look. This is one that we borrowed. Okay, go ahead.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our Juneteenth special broadcast, we turn now to Nikole Hannah-Jones, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist who created the 1619 Project. In March, Nikole Hannah-Jones addressed the United Nations General Assembly as the UN marked the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade.
Good morning. It is my deepest honor to speak before you today on this day of international remembrance of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. I have dedicated my life's work to excavating the modern legacy of transatlantic slavery, and so my thoughts are never far from what has become the defining subject of my journalism, and what I believe continues to be the defining undercurrent of life in the Americas, the legacy of slavery. I stand before you, the great-great-grandchild of enslaved men and women born here in the United States of America, part of the millions who lived and died under the brutal, immoral, and inhumane system of chattel slavery that existed for the first 250 years of the land that would come to think of itself as the freest nation in the history of the world. We gather here to mark the global trade that took some 15 million beloved human beings across the Atlantic in the hulls of barbaric ships, the largest forced migration in the history of the world, one that would reshape the entire Atlantic world and transform the global economy. We must never forget the scale and the depth of the horrors that people of African descent suffered in the name of profit that enriched the European colonial powers and built the nascent economy of the United States. We must never forget how the systems of slavery collapsed only to be reborn in other models of violent and racist economic exploitation, such as what we benignly call Jim Crow in the United States, but what is more aptly called apartheid. But on this solemn day of remembrance, the looking back cannot be and should not be solely defined by African-descended people's enslavement. Just as defining, just as important to remembering the legacy of the transatlantic slavery are the stories of Black resistance that would, more than any other force, lead to slavery's collapse in our hemisphere. No people voluntarily submit to their enslavement, and by obscuring the role of Black resistance in our collective rememberings of the transatlantic slave trade, we continue to do the work of those who sought to justify slavery by stripping us of our collective humanity. People of African descent resisted their enslavement from the moment of their capture. They resisted on the long walk from the interior of Africa to the coast. They resisted in the castles before being dragged out to the waiting ships. They resisted so frequently on the water that slave ships had to be specially designed to try to prevent mutiny. The ocean became the final resting place of thousands of Africans who resisted by choosing a final swim with the ancestors over enslavement in a strange land. As we remember our brutal enslavement by people who believed themselves to be civilized, even as they tortured, abused, and murdered other human beings for profit, for sugar for their tea, for molasses for their rum, for cotton to wear, and for tobacco to smoke, we must remember most the fierce Black radical tradition of resistance that did not begin with anti-colonialism efforts on the continent or with civil rights movements in the United States and other places, but with, as the scholar Cedric Robinson argued, the Chimarrones of Mexico, who ran away to indigenous communities or formed their own fugitive communities known as palenques. We must remember Yanga, who led a community of fugitive Africans and fought the Spaniards so fiercely that they won their status as a free Black settlement. We must remember Brazil's quilombolas, including Palmares, a fugitive Black community that would endure for 90 years in the Portuguese colony that would import more Africans into slavery than anywhere else in the Atlantic world. We must remember the Maroons of British and French Guyana, Cuba, and the United States, and the Bush Negroes of Suriname, who fought against their oppressors for 5 decades as they were attempting to re-enslave them. We must remember the revolts of enslaved people in Jamaica in 1690, in New York City in 1712, Queen Nanny in 1720, the Stono Rebellion in 1739, and Tacky's Rebellion in 1760. We must remember the successful uprising of enslaved people, the most successful uprising of enslaved people in the history of the world, the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people rose up and defeated 3 mighty colonial empires, becoming the first nation in the Americas to abolish slavery and establishing the world's first free Black republic, an audacity that the Western world has punished Haiti for ever since. We must remember revolts in Barbados in 1816, the Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831, and Nat Turner's rebellion that same year in the United States, as Black people attempted to make manifest the words of Patrick Henry, the famed American revolutionary who proclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death," even as he enslaved African human beings for profit. We must remember freedom fighters such as Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Gabriel Prosser. We must remember that it was not merely the Enlightenment ideas, some reckoning amongst white abolitionists, that brought the end to the system that had enriched colonial powers, but that abolition was propelled by constant revolt that forced colonial powers to realize, as scholar Mary Reckford wrote, it would remain more expensive and dangerous to maintain the old system than to abolish it. Black people were actors in their own freedom. Obscuring and marginalizing stories of Black resistance serves to justify the hypocrisy of colonial Europe and the United States by insinuating that had slavery been so bad, surely African peoples would have fought harder against it. These are lies of omission that in the absence of truth, warp our collective memory. Resistance, therefore, must be central to any remembrances of the transatlantic slave trade and must, therefore, be connected to the ongoing resistance movements in the fight for Black liberation across the globe. I stand here before you today, a recipient of that tradition of resistance. My father was born in a little shack in 1945 on a cotton plantation in Greenwood, Mississippi. He was born into a family of sharecroppers, the violently enforced system of labor exploitation that emerged at the end of slavery. He was born into a strictly apartheid state, one where Black people could not vote, could not use the public library, could not attend schools with white children, and were lynched for things such as starting a union, walking into a room where a white woman was alone, failing to get off of the sidewalk fast enough in deference to a white person, or the greatest crime of all in the American South, having the audacity to be a financially prosperous Black person. In Greenwood in the 1940s, life was so devastating that Black children could be put to the fields as early as the age of 3 to start carrying water to workers. So when my father was 2 years old, my grandmother, Arlena Paul, a Black woman sharecropper, packed a suitcase and loaded her 2 young children on a northbound train and escaped the apartheid of the American South. My grandmother had a 4th grade education, and she would spend the rest of her life as a domestic and a janitor. But that single act of resistance, leaving the racial caste system of the American South with nothing but the determination that her own children would not pick cotton like she had, like her parents had, like her enslaved grandparents before her had, set in motion the events that would lead me to stand before this distinguished body today, addressing this most esteemed convening representing all of the nations of the world. Hers was an act of resistance that mirrored those of millions of enslaved Black people who resisted every day in ways big and small. She, like our ancestors, resisted in order to plant the seed for freedoms and opportunities that she would never see for herself. And it is this history, this understanding, that leads me to argue that the defining story of the African diaspora in the Americas is not slavery, but our resistance to it, of people determined to be free in societies that did not believe they had a right to freedom. We must acknowledge this history as the legacy of slavery can be seen all around us. Today, the descendants of slavery fight to resist their conditions in the societies that once enslaved them. They suffer the highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of incarceration, the highest rates of death, and the highest rates of violence. And the tradition of resistance continues in protests against police violence and inequality from Brazil to Cuba to the United States. But we, the people of the African diaspora, should not have to find ourselves still resisting. It is long past time for the European colonial powers, for the United States of America, to live up to their own professed ideas, to become the great and moral nations that they believe themselves to be. It is not enough to simply regret what was done in the past. They are obligated to repair it. As I stand before representatives of the countries that once enslaved African peoples and the peoples who were once enslaved, as we collectively remember this day, the way for me to honor those who toiled and died and fought is to say this clearly and without flinching. It is time for the nations that engaged in and profited from the transatlantic slave trade to do what is right and what is just. It is time for them to make reparations to the descendants of chattel slavery in the Americas. This is our global truth, the truth we as human beings understand with stark clarity. There can be no atonement if there is no repair. It is time, it is long past time for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade and all the devastation that it has wrought and all the devastation that it continues to reap. I thank you very much for your attention as we all remember this crime against humanity together. Thank you.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist who created the 1619 Project. When we come back, we look at how Harvard University has revealed the school's extensive ties to slavery. We'll speak to MIT historian Craig Steven Wilder, author of Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America.
Okay. That was one of the most brilliant, articulate, factual presentation on slavery that I've heard yet. This woman who was a college professor, I understand she is teaching at Howard University. knows her facts, has done her research, and is working to try to bring about reparations. Let me just sort of back up a little bit and with you a little bit about my situation. And I say mine, I'm talking personally now. And I've said this before, but I was born in a community called Spring Hill. That is on the outskirts of the city of Thomasville, Georgia, in Thomas County, Georgia. This is where my ancestors settled. My ancestors migrated after slavery, and they were slaves. Many of them, most of them, migrated to Thomasville. Now, mine was a tale of two families. My mother was an Armster. She also had some mixed Native American blood, starting in Virginia. My father was a James, also starting in Virginia, and they settled. My father settled in Spring Hill. My mother was raised on what they call the Archibald Plantation, which is in Boston, Georgia, which is only a few miles from where my father was raised. My father used to tell us about stories when he was courting my mom. He would ride a bicycle for 10 miles over there to see her, and 10 miles back. Well, at any rate, let's talk about the James situation. My grandfather, and I'm not quite sure how it was done, were not sharecroppers. Not all Blacks were sharecroppers. My grandfather, according to the research that we've done, had 150 acres of land. 150 acres of land. But because he was prosperous, remember what she said, is that the racists did not like for Black people to be prosperous, but my grandfather was very prosperous. They decided to attack our community, which is Spring Hill. And the Ku Klux Klan, in their white robes, came up Hall Road. Hall Road is the way in and the way out of Springfield, Spring Hill. And they came in, and back in those days, the Hall Road was mud, and they had trenches on each side. Well, at any rate, the Klan was allowed to get so far into the community, and then they were surrounded, and they were devastated. And they said many of the Klansmen were injured doing that thing. And that attack was won by my relatives and my family under the leadership of my grandfather, Richard C. James. But they identified my grandfather as being the leader of the Blacks who fought against the Klan. So some of the guys had to leave because they had been identified. And remember, back in those days, the law was not on your side. The law was against you. The law and the Klan were one. And we find that so true wherever you go. So my grandfather left Spring Hill and moved to Detroit, Michigan. And back in those days, Detroit was jumping in terms of the auto industry. They were building cars. So he went up there and stayed there, never to return. And my grandmother with 7 kids were forced, the land was taken from them, every acre. And she was forced to move from this 150 acre plot to a 40 acre plot that her parents owned. Caroline James was my grandmother, and she had to raise those 7 kids herself, and also at the same time take care of Hager Barnes and Nathan Barnes, who were her parents, who were getting elderly and coming along. So she did that, and so as a blessing to support her, that her parents left that 40 acres to them. But my uncle, through his own intelligence and tenacity, was able to have his own estate. Now remember, these folks were born at the end of slavery. And he did it himself in spite of the racism and the resistance from white folks. But you could purchase some land and own some land in that area. Now, some states wouldn't even allow you to purchase, but my family was able to do that. But unfortunately, that land was taken away from them. What I'm doing is getting back to the issue of reparations. 150 acres taken away. And to send my folks a check, say for $20,000, would be an insult. We need to have our land and our property restored. At least 150 acres, no matter where it is. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that how do you account for what happened and make people whole? If you're gonna make people whole, then you make them whole. That's the thing. So in my personal family, we're aware of this. We have a cousin named James Jack Hatley that has established a museum. In fact, we had him on the Richard James show about a year ago. He took this man who was a brilliant man. He was a retired federal worker in the postal system. But he put together an organization and a committee, and they purchased the old Black high school, Frederick Douglass High School. And they took that high school and took the buildings and turned that into a museum. And if you want to get some genealogical facts about family, about history of our people, not just my family, but others, then you want to go to James Jack Hatley Museum. One of the persons that on display there at his museum is Jackie Robinson and Matt Robinson. We need reparation. We need repair. But if you're talking about repair, even though there should be some type of cash or monetary reward for those folks, you're also going to have to do away with systemic racism, systemic discrimination. What good is it to get a small check? And I'm saying $20,000, and this economy is a small check, and still block businesses, small businesses, from getting a loan in order to make their businesses work. You hear what I'm saying? And still stop individuals from being discriminated against when they try to seek employment. So if you're going to talk about reparations, then you need to talk about a total package and evaluate every aspect of it. Really, really important. Because as long as you don't do that, as long as you don't do it correctly, there will be protests. Now, they allowed the Voting Rights Act to lapse. There is no Voting Rights Act now. John Lewis fought to keep that into effect, and it didn't happen. So we take one step forward, and they take 2 steps backwards. In one hand, they're lifted up and pretend to be our friend, and the other hand, they slap us down. And that's just the reality. So reparations. Reparations, yes, we need reparations. Okay. So now we're going to listen to Professor Coates and some things that he had to say. He's a well-renowned author, and he's an expert on slavery and the transatlantic transportation and exploitation of 15 million Black folks. We'll listen to the next Democracy Now!
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
As we continue to talk about the call for slavery reparations, we spend the rest of the hour with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who testified at Wednesday's hearing. He's the author of several books, including We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy. He's also the author of Between the World and Me, for which he received the 2015 National Book Award for Nonfiction. He's now a writer in residence at New York University.
Ta-Nehisi Coates' seminal 2014 essay, The Case for Reparations, helped spur new calls to make amends for slavery. Today, he joins us for the hour. Ta-Nehisi, thanks so much for being with us. Can you talk about the origins of this hearing, the first in a dozen years, and the bill that is being considered and what you hope to come of this? Did you ever dream that this is what would come of, well, it's been going on for decades, but 5 years ago you intensified the discussion with your Atlantic piece on reparations?
Yeah, no, it's been, I have to be honest, it's been absolutely fascinating to watch. I think the thing that people need to understand about the fight for reparations is precisely how old it is. I mean, this goes back to Belinda Royal, who sued the estate of Isaac Royal back in post-colonial times after the American Revolution, up through Callie House in the 19th century, into James Foreman Sr., who was a leader at SNCC making his demand for reparations, up through in Cobra, and people like Professor Charles Ogletree. So this is a long fight. And when I published The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, my hope was to just make my entry into that fight. I didn't expect it to quite get here. I think this is definitely progress. I don't think this is anywhere near the end goal, but I think yesterday was progress.
Well, Ta-Nehisi, you made, of course, a number of extremely powerful remarks during your testimony, among which you said, quote, "It's impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery." So for our international audience and others who aren't quite as familiar with this history, could you explain what you mean by that? It's impossible to understand America without this inheritance.
Well, sure. The two great crimes in American history is obviously the destruction of this country's Native American, the near destruction, I should say, not the destruction, the near destruction of this country's Native American population, the theft of their land. And on to work that land was brought in Native Africans into this country beginning in 1619. Those twin processes profoundly altered the shape of the world and made this country possible. Obviously, first of all, the land on which America and Americans currently reside was the land of Native Americans. But the people brought in to break that land just transformed it. The profits derived from slavery are more extreme than I think are commonly acknowledged. As I said yesterday, in 1860, the combined worth of the 4 million enslaved Black people in this country was some $3 billion, nearly $75 billion in today's share of dollars. Cotton in 1860 was this country's largest export, not just its largest export, it was the majority of exports out of this country. So from a financial perspective, just the economics of it, it's absolutely impossible to imagine America without enslavement. The onset of the Civil War, the greatest preponderance, the greatest population per capita of millionaires and multimillionaires in this country was in the Mississippi River Valley. It wasn't in Boston, wasn't in Chicago, wasn't in New York. The richest people in this country were slaveholders. Most of our earliest presidents were slaveholders. And the fact that they were presidents is not incidental to the fact that they're to their slaveholding. That was how they built their wealth. That was how Thomas Jefferson built his wealth. That was how George Washington built his wealth. Individual slaves were the equivalent of, say, owning a home today. They were people, but turned into objects of extreme wealth. So just from the economic perspective, there's that. And just forgive me for extending a little bit, but there's also the fact of what America actually is culturally. Our greatest export today is our entertainment and it is our culture. It is impossible to imagine American culture without jazz, without the blues, without hip hop. It's impossible to imagine American cinema without, regrettably, Birth of a Nation. It's impossible to imagine American literature at this point without James Baldwin, without Toni Morrison. All of these are the primary, secondary, and tertiary fruits of slavery. And so if you strip slavery out of America, if you strip black people out of America, you really don't have an America.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, I wanted to go to a clip of you speaking at this historic hearing yesterday before the House Judiciary Committee chair, answering Chairman Jerry Nadler.
It's been said, I think, or alluded to repeatedly throughout this conversation that somehow wealthy African Americans are immune to these effects. But in addition to the wealth gap that's cited, one thing that folks should keep in mind is that quote-unquote wealthy African Americans are not the equivalent of quote-unquote wealthy white Americans in this country. The average African American family in this country making $100,000, just, decent money, actually lives in the same kind of neighborhood that the average white family making $35,000 a year lives in. That is totally tied to the legacy of enslavement and Jim Crow, and the input and the idea in the mind that white people and black people are somehow deserving of different things. If I injure you, the injury persists even after I actually commit the act. If I stab you, you may suffer complications long after that initial actual stabbing. If I shoot you, you may suffer complications long after that initial shooting. That's the case with African Americans. There are people well within the living memory of this country that are still suffering from the after effects of that.
Thank you very much.
So that is Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking at the hearing. And with that, I want to go back to just a clip of what the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said.
I heard it said just earlier, for instance, that
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. We've, tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president.
So I want to point out that the question that he was asked about reparations, about apologies for slavery, was asked by a young African-American reporter named Eva McKend of Spectrum. His comment is being heard everywhere, but the reporter herself is only being talked about on Democracy Now! And the significance of this, Ta-Nehisi, and then if you can talk about the bill that's being considered. I mean, you yourself said when you started your historic piece 5 years ago on the case for reparations, you yourself weren't convinced.
Yeah, and first of all, I want to thank you for, shouting out that reporter. That actually has meaning, because you need a black reporter there in the first place to actually ask the question, to, set all of this in motion. So that's true. No, and to be honest with you, for instance, the previous answer I just gave you on, the economics of enslavement and its relationship to this country, I would not have been able to give you that answer. I think, so when I started in 2014, I actually was at that point for reparations, but you're referring back to something I wrote in 2012 when I was, against. I wouldn't have been able to give you that answer. I didn't have that level of knowledge. And beyond that, I didn't have the level of knowledge on how it persisted. I mean, I had a vague sense of segregation, Jim Crow, et cetera, in the 100 years after. But I didn't know about redlining, not in that degree of detail. And I didn't know how this extraction, as I call it, of wealth from the African-American community laundered through the state into the white community, through redlining, through the FHA loan program, through the GI Bill. I just didn't have knowledge of that. And once I saw that, it's like, wow, this is a persistent, a pattern of extraction that needs a really, really radical answer. At that point, reparations made total sense to me. But I will add that it made sense to plenty of people long before it made sense to me.
And Ta-Nehisi, could you talk about, how do you think conversations about reparations in the American public sphere have changed since the publication of your Atlantic piece?
I'm not, that piece got a lot of attention. I'm not totally convinced that that's why this is happening right now. I just really want to say again that the people have been fighting this battle for a long time, and so it's like you put drops of water in a glass, and eventually the glass tips over, and you see some sort of larger effect. I was building on the work, when I published in 2014, only 10, 15 years ago, there had been Randall Robinson's The Debt, as I mentioned earlier, the efforts of Charles Oak. So there have been all of these little, sort of efforts that didn't get the same degree of coverage. That's the first thing. And I also think having your first black president followed up by, someone who I've referred to as your first white president has had a tremendously radicalizing effect on a lot of people.
Can you talk about, this discussion about reparations immediately last night on the talk shows, what are they talking about? Giving checks? Who exactly would be involved? Who would get the money? How would this be determined? Go back to when Abraham Lincoln signed a bill emancipating enslaved people. The slave owners around Washington, D.C., being given reparations for each enslaved person that they freed.
Right.
What was it, $300 a person?
Right. I can't remember the number, but yeah, you're exactly correct. And in fact, Lincoln offered that to several. He did this idea of what it was called compensated emancipation at the time, and he offered it to several of the border slave states, Delaware, I believe, Maryland, Kentucky. Also, that was a plan to compensate the actual slaveholders. And I should say that's a global pattern throughout history. The country of Haiti, for having the temerity to actually liberate itself from enslavers, was forced to pay reparations to France, the country that had actually enslaved the people there. So this is a global pattern, with people enslaved. It is only for questions of power that, we find ourselves able to countenance the idea that people who have done the enslaving should have been compensated, and that was fine. And not just people who were enslaved, but people who are suffering the effects of that afterwards should not be compensated.
So talk about what are the possible...
I'm sorry, can I just add, can I add one quick thing also, Amy? This whole thing about who should get a check and should we cut checks, I understand those questions, that's great. Those people should support H.R. 40, though. Because that's what H.R. 40 does. It tries to get that figured out and get that math figured out and figure out the best way to do it. But if we don't actually have a study, we can't actually answer those questions. You can't ask a doctor to make a diagnosis before there's an actual examination. Those people who have all of those questions should support H.R. 40. They should be his biggest supporters.
Well, Ta-Nehisi Coates, I want to go back to some of the enduring legacy of slavery in the U.S. The House Budget Committee held a hearing on poverty in America, and Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, called for a moral budget, framing the epidemic of poverty as a, quote, moral crisis.
It is tragic in a society where our first constitutional duty is to establish justice and promote the general welfare, that we will allow the injustice of poverty. 43.5% of poor people are poverty and low wealth, and people here who could teach this society. And we would walk away from our constitutional values and walk away from our spiritual values that tell us that it is dangerous for a nation not to lift up the poor.
Reverend Dr. Barber is wearing a sash that says Jesus was a poor man. And I just want to point out, so you're having this hearing on Juneteenth, And the Budget Committee is having this historic hearing on Juneteenth, and you're actually speaking at exactly the same time. That hearing culminated 3 days of the Poor People's Campaign, of course, picked up from the last year of Dr. Martin Luther King's life as he led the Poor People's Campaign. Democracy Now! Was there on Monday at the Trinity University when Dr. Barber and Dr. Liz Theo-Harris questioned 9 presidential candidates about this issue of the connections of poverty and racism, saying this issue of extreme poverty was not raised once in one of the presidential debates of 2016. Can you talk about this trajectory from slavery to what we're describing today?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in this moment, one of the reasons why, this sort of, all of these questions that may have been, off of the table in 2016 or off the table in 2008, it's not that people weren't raising them. It's not that, people weren't making a point. But I just think, in reaction to what's going on in this country right now, people are just much, much more open. And in terms of poverty and race in this country, again, one of the things that I really, really wanted to stress is it's the level of poverty specifically that you see in the African-American community. It's not accidental. It's not accidental. This is part of the process. The process of enslavement involves stealing something from someone. It involves taking something from someone. Jim Crow was theft. First and foremost, it was theft. If I tax you, or if I tell you you have to be loyal to this country and pledge fealty to its laws, but then I don't give you the same degree of protection, I don't give you the same access to resources that I give to another group of people, I have effectively stolen something from you. I've stolen your tax money, I've stolen your fealty, I've stolen your loyalty. So when the state of Mississippi, for instance, taxes black people and then builds one facility for education and another one facility for education for whites and then an inferior facility for blacks, that's theft. That's theft. If I build a public pool system and then tell you you can't use that public pool system, that's theft. And so that is the long history of this country that doesn't end, again, conservatively until, in 1968. And so there are people who are very, very much alive who've experienced that, who are suffering the after effects and effects of that. And that's what, as far as I'm concerned, the whole movement around reparations is about. And I, suspect I didn't hear, Dr. Reverend Barber's comments, but I suspect there's quite a bit of overlap there, too.
Well, I want to ask Ta-Nehisi about what may be a changing perception of the position that the African-American community in the U.S. is in, and a possible change in what ought to be done about it. A recent survey by the Associated Press found that 52% of Americans believe the government doesn't put enough resources into improving the conditions of African-Americans, but only 30% think the government is obliged to compensate for past racial discrimination. Your response to that and the distinction between the two?
I think people, again, I said this yesterday, I think people are very, very uncomfortable when we start talking about the things in America's past that do not credit us. Again, we have no problem at all taking credit for the things that, people who, are no longer here, who were in our past. We have no problem taking credit for their efforts. You take somebody like Mitch McConnell, who does not want to be responsible for, enslavement that happened 150 years ago, but yet and still wants the right to operate his business or operate his career in a building that was built by enslaved people. And so we have no problem taking the credits, the benefits, for what was done in our past. But when you start talking, to people about actually paying that, back, or actually, some sort of evenness around that, there, a lot of discomfort comes up. I understand that. I would like to also, take only, my paycheck and not have to pay my bills. I would like that too. That would be great, but I think if this idea of patriotism and citizenship is, to mean anything, you can't, as I say, be a fair weather friend to your country. You can't, decide that your past only matters, that you want to invoke, your country as a land of the free when you want to go invade Iraq, for instance. And then, when you're being called to be responsible for what made, it possible for that country to be called land of the free in the first place, to act like, you don't owe anybody anything, or you're not part of this, especially, as I said yesterday, when a lot of this happened in your own lifetime. It isn't the past. It happened while you were alive. Mitch McConnell was 26 years old by the time the Voting Rights Act was passed. So this is very well within the lifetime of living people today.
I want to go to Coleman Hughes, the columnist for Quillette undergraduate at Columbia University, who spoke out against reparations.
I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here, and we're not entitled to collect on their debts. Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, can you respond to Coleman Hughes, who testified at the same hearing that you led off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the testimony was that one should not receive payment that would properly be due to the enslaved. But this country is, to this very day, receiving payment that was due to its enslavers. That's the way inheritance works, in this country. However, one might feel about that. If I assemble a mass of money, I have the right to pass that on to my kid. My kid has the right to do whatever and then pass it on, to their kid. And so there's something fundamentally unjust if I have secured that money by taking it from one group and then I pass that money on to my kid. My kid, by the way, continues to do injustice to the descendants of that other group. And we're allowed to continually collect. I don't want to fall into this trap, and I really tried to make this clear yesterday. This didn't end with enslavement. Reparations isn't just about enslavement. There was the 250 years of enslavement, that period of theft. After that, there was 100 years of terror, that period of theft. And, I would argue, in fact, our present system of mass incarceration emerges right out of that. And so, this notion that a nation somehow only, especially when we're talking about its debits, that it only lasts through the lifetime of its present generation is clearly ridiculous. The state itself would fall apart if that were true. If all of our treaties were broken when this generation died, if all of our taxes and responsibilities, if we said to pensioners, we will no longer pay you because the people that, made the decisions about those wars are no longer alive, we would have a huge problem. As I said yesterday, to this very day, or at least I should say as recently as 2017, we were paying pensions to the heirs of Civil War widows. I mean, this is tremendous that we would recognize our ties to the past when it comes to certain things, but not other things.
Democratic presidential contender Joe Biden is under fire for fondly reminiscing about his civil relationship with segregationist senators in the 1970s and 1980s. Speaking at a fundraiser at the Carlyle Hotel in New York City Tuesday night, Biden expressed nostalgia for his relationship with the late Democratic pro-segregation senators James Eastland of Mississippi and Herman Talmadge of Georgia. Biden reportedly said, quote, "I was in a caucus with James Eastland. He never called me boy. He called me son," Biden said.
Biden went on to say, a guy like Herman Talmadge, one of the meanest guys I ever know, you go down the list of all these guys, well, guess what? At least there was some civility. We got things done. Biden was widely criticized by other Democratic presidential contenders. He was asked on Wednesday if he would apologize.
Are you going to apologize like Cory Booker has called for?
For what?
Cory Booker's called for it.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. Period. Period. Period.
Biden spoke after Senator Cory Booker had issued a statement reading, quote, "Vice President Biden's relationships with proud segregationists are not the model for how we make America a safer and more inclusive place for Black people and for everyone. Frankly, I'm disappointed that he hasn't issued an immediate apology for the pain his words are dredging up for many Americans. He should," Booker said.
Other candidates also weighed in. Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted, "I agree with Cory Booker. This is especially true at a time when the Trump administration is trying to divide us up with its racist appeals." New York Mayor Bill de Blasio posted a photo of his family on Twitter and wrote, quote, "It's 2019, and Joe Biden is longing for the good old days of civility typified by James Eastland. Eastland thought my multiracial family should be illegal and that whites were entitled to the pursuit of dead N-words." Senator Kamala Harris said, quote, "Yes, it concerns me deeply. If those men had their way, I would not be in the United States Senate." Senator Elizabeth Warren said, quote, "I'm not here to criticize other Democrats, but it's never okay to celebrate segregationists. Never." Ta-Nehisi Coates, your thoughts?
I mean, it's just more of the same. It's just more of the same. I mean, you know, Joe
Should Biden
says,
apologize?
I mean, Joe Biden shouldn't be president. You know, obviously, I don't think I'm breaking any news here. You know, if he ends up being the nominee, better him than Trump. But, you know, I think that's a really, really low standard. I think when you have somebody who is celebrating their relationship, the ability of, you know, a person who saw no problem depriving an entire, you know, population of African Americans in their state of the right to vote, the right to participate as American citizens, the fact that that person was polite to them. I mean, it's nice that Eastland never called, or Talmadge, whoever it was, never called Joe Biden boy. It's nice that Joe Biden had that privilege. But the fact of the matter is Joe Biden owes his very presence in the race right now to the first black president, to Barack Obama. And if it were up to Eastland and if it were up to Talmadge, Barack Obama would not only not be in the White House, he actually would not exist. And so I don't know what is, you know, going on in your brain where you decide to celebrate the fact that these people were polite. They could afford to be polite because the major opposition, you know, in their state, that being African Americans, was effectively at that time, in their time, through the, you know, most of their career, wiped out of the political process and erased as an electorate. You know, Joe Biden says that. He's been involved with civil rights his entire career. It's worth remembering Joe Biden opposed busing and bragged about it. You know, in the 1970s, Joe Biden, you know, is on the record as being to the right of actually the New Democrats in the 1990s on the issue of mass incarceration. Wanted more people sentenced to the death penalty. Wanted more jails. And so, I'm not surprised. I mean, this is who Joe Biden is. You know, there's that saying, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. This is who Joe Biden is.
Well, Ta-Nehisi, what about your assessment of the other candidates in the Democratic presidential field? Right
y'all
after
trying to get me again, huh?
After your piece was published in The Atlantic, you met with Elizabeth Warren.
I did, yes, I did.
Can you talk about that?
No. No, not this time.
But Ta-Nehisi, what are you paying particular attention to with these candidates? I mean, it was interesting yesterday after Biden made his comments to donors on Tuesday night and said, you know, Eastland didn't call me boy, he called me son. Now, again, Senator Eastland, who talked about African Americans as the inferior race, was called the voice of the white South. Yes, as you pointed out, obviously, he didn't call him boy. Joe Biden is white. But you're the first two people to speak out, as far as I could tell, were first Cory Booker, and then he referred to Cory immediately as Cory and said Cory should apologize to him, Joe Biden. And then as well, you had Kamala Harris speaking out, the African-American senator from California. And then, of course, Warren and Biden, rather Warren and Bernie Sanders and de Blasio. But what are you looking for in these candidates, the stands you want to see them taking?
I think I would like to see somebody, listen, it's understandable where a large portion of this country is. They want to see somebody who can beat Trump. I get that. And there is, you know, a feeling, I think, among certain people that Joe Biden can out-white man Donald Trump. I'm not convinced of that. I don't think anybody can out-white man Donald Trump. I hope that what we'll see eventually is something more than I can beat Donald Trump. Like I can beat Donald Trump should be the floor. I get that beating Donald Trump is extremely, extremely important. I get that, but I just hope that that's the floor, you know, and not the ceiling.
All right. That's the name of that tune. We kind of deviated at the end, and this was an old film, by the way, when Joe Biden was first running for president. The initial conversation was on reparations, and that's where it should be, and that's where it should stay. Joe Biden is the president of the United States. Kamala Harris was selected by Joe to be his running mate, and she is the vice president of the United States. And quite frankly, anybody who will pick Donald Trump over Kamala Harris and Joe Biden has a problem. And certainly, this whole issue of reparation. First of all, when people have to admit to themselves that they have committed a wrong, and it has to be rectified. And the only way we can do it is reparations, and not just cash donation, but systemic changes in the way we do things. I want to thank you all for tuning in and visiting. Don't forget us, we're still down in Lebanon at 35 South 8th Street. And we solicit and need your support, and thank you for all those folks that come in that have given us their support and come by and let us know they're on our side. We still have African clothing and a whole bunch of things, and you won't find anyone's prices that will match mine. So God bless you all, and until we see each other again next week, take care. This is Richard James signing off. So long.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. And thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let's hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. And so I'll see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.